Some studies suggest that upwards of 20% of the people who develop osteoarthritis of their knee do so because they've had a previous injury to their knee. Oftentimes, that injury relates to a really important structure within the knee called the cruciate ligament, or the ACL, the anterior cruciate ligament. That typically occurs in younger adults aged between 15 and 25. And the consequences of that are really substantial, as a substantial proportion of those people go on long-term to develop knee osteoarthritis. We've spoken about this, both the prevalence, the increasing epidemic of ACL cruciate ligament injuries, and the impact that has on osteoarthritis in previous episodes with Tim Hewitt, Jackie Whitaker, Yusra and I. So it's a really, really important issue for osteoarthritis. We've also spoken about the importance of injury prevention, so primary prevention of these injuries, to see if we can actually impact the number of people who are developing osteoarthritis long-term. And that has a whole range of benefits, including enhancing athletic performance, prolonging activity participation, so people can actually continue to participate in their sport, lowering healthcare costs, improving quality of life, reducing rehabilitation time from those injuries, and boosting confidence in the people that participate in those injury prevention programs. Today, we dig into this a little bit more. Why? Well, in part because of two articles that have recently come out in the Medical Journal of Australia, led in the first instance by Andrew Ross, who works in the physiotherapy department, specifically looking at the costs related to implementing knee injury prevention training program and the benefits in terms of quality of life. And that was accompanied by an editorial that was written by Prof. Schilling, who's a health economist, specifically looking at the merits or otherwise of implementing a program such as that. It's a really technical edition of the Joint Action podcast. I do it in part because it's something that's near and dear to my heart. It's something near and dear to what ideally politicians and policymakers should be listening to, because most of the studies have specifically looked at this topic. The return on investment is substantial. And we shouldn't just be looking at it in terms of cost, but that's ultimately the reality when you're talking to politicians. We're coming up towards an election cycle in Australia, and I know a number of other countries around the world that don't currently have injury prevention programs that are provided nationally are similarly in election years. So we're really pleased to have Andrew Ross and Chris Schilling come along to talk about the next steps for ACL injury prevention. Hello, Andrew and Chris. Welcome to the show.
Hi, David. Thanks for the invitation.
Great to be here. Thanks, David.
Yeah, it's absolutely my pleasure. It's a topic that's very near and dear to my heart. And so it's a wonderful opportunity to dig into it a little bit further. But without further ado, really in an effort to get to know both of you a little bit better, Andrew, what I might get you to do is to go first, if that's okay. Can you just share with the listeners a little bit more about your background and what a typical day looks like?
Sure, yeah, no problem. Thanks, David. I'm a physiotherapist by profession. So currently I'm working at Victoria University as a physio lecturer and researcher. I suppose I'll share a little bit about my journey, about how I came to writing a paper on the primary prevention of ACL injuries. I worked as a clinical physiotherapist for about 12 years, ran my own physiotherapy business, worked with amateur footballers as a coach and as a physiotherapist, and played the game myself as well. But what ended up sort of happening was that I did a master's in public health. And then from there, I became a little bit more interested in preventing these ACL injuries from ever occurring. It was a sort of new concept that came up during that study, and then sort of started to look at it a little bit more from an academic perspective. And I ended up doing my thesis on nationwide sports injury prevention strategies. And then that really fed into a PhD opportunity at Sydney University with Associate Professor Kerry Peake as my supervisor, and looking really at amateur football injuries in the state of New South Wales.
Wonderful. And Andrew, just out of interest, are you still involved in doing some aspect of injury prevention?
Yeah, that's still really at the heart of everything I want to do, is sports injury prevention. So at the minute, we're sort of looking a little bit at heading injuries, and we're sort of just started to look a little bit at header prep program created by Carey and some other researchers. So we're looking at that and also looking at really other ways of implementing these types of injury prevention programs into amateur clubs.
Yeah, wonderful. Now, for the listeners out there, you may not necessarily have a perspective of what background I'm looking at behind Andrew, but it's very red. And I'm going to ask you, Andrew, when you're not doing your day job, what do you enjoy doing? And potentially it relates to your background.
Yeah, look, well, what David's talking about there is Anfield Football Club, but Liverpool Football Club in the UK. That's a team actually I've been supporting for quite some time. Really, all my family, well, my kids anyway, support it. My wife is a Man United fan, but we won't go there. But I'm football mad. I still play the game at a very amateur level when I can, and I'll be involved in coaching. My daughter plays NPL. So really, if I'm not doing anything with regards to teaching and research, I'm doing something else with regards to football, whether it's listening to podcasts or coaching or whatever.
Superb. And does your daughter practice any injury prevention herself?
Well, that's the problem, right? Her father is an injury prevention researcher, so she's doing the Perform Plus and the FIFA 11 and header prep. She's doing everything really. And, when I can get her to do it, as we know, these things are hard to implement. Yeah, so she does do stuff and her team does quite a bit actually. So as we're probably going to get into, yeah.
Excellent. And if you had to describe yourself in 5 words, what words would you use?
I did ask my wife this question. I did ask my kids, but I got a kind of strange response from them. So my first one would be devoted. I've got 3 kids and I'm a husband. Second one is an interesting one. I would say droll, which is kind of a Scottish word for oddly amusing. And then the third one is fanatic. So there's the football side of it. The fourth one, hyper focused. And the fifth one, inquisitive. So really leaning there on the kind of research side of things.
Wonderful. Chris, over to you. But if you could share with us a little bit more about your background in a typical day.
Oh, lovely to hear your background too, Andrew. I'm a health economist. And so basically that means that my job is to look at the costs and benefits of the interventions within our healthcare system. The government can't fund everything. And so really what I do on a day-to-day basis is to try and help them think about, well, what works and what doesn't? Are the things that we're making freely available to our population, are they delivering good quality of care and a high level and a high value of care? And one of the ways that I do that, and kind of one of the tools and techniques that I use, is an application called simulation modeling. And really that's where we build analysis tools that let us answer so what questions, or what if questions, like what if a new stem cell therapy could completely alter the trajectory of osteoarthritis? What would that mean in terms of the costs and benefits and the trajectory of someone's life and the health interventions that they might have to have or not have? And in the case of Andrew's paper, what if we're able to actually implement a population-wide injury prevention program? What would that mean in terms of reduced numbers of surgeries and hospitalizations and ED visits down the track? And so we build those tools so that we can help government and decision makers to understand whether or not that's going to be a good thing to do.
Wonderful. Yeah, I mean, it's so important because obviously, as you both well know, resources are not limitless. And oftentimes we just pay attention to the efficacy of certain treatments, but not necessarily the harms and more infrequently, even the costs related to that. And so it's really important to consider those. Chris, now, when you're not doing your day job, what do you like to do?
I'm also very sporty, so I'm a terrible football player though, so I end up mostly on the tennis courts, hitting some balls around and going for the odd run and spending time with my family. I've just had 2 twin baby girls, so at the moment pretty much everything's on hold and away from work is full-time dad.
Wonderful, congratulations. And you getting any sleep?
A little bit. So when I saw the questions about, how would you describe yourself in 5 words? Well, I couldn't come up with 5, but I was thinking, well, I'd like to think I'm kind and I'm sporty and I'm driven, but definitely these last few months I'm pretty tired.
Well, as a father of 4, I'm hoping that it slowly improves over time. And I'm sure Andrew can attest to the fact that in time, they do end up sleeping a little bit more and then they change their body clocks to a point where, they become teenagers and the shift is such that you end up getting a bit sleepless at the late end of the day as well. It's fascinating the way it runs. Now, for everybody who's out there, you're probably wondering why I've got two different people talking about the same topic. Well, I guess just firstly, by way of background, Andrew wrote an article recently in the Medical Journal of Australia, and that's really prompted this discussion. And Chris, as good, thoughtful academicians do, wrote a response to that article called an editorial, just really looking at the merits and otherwise of that. And so that's the benefit of having two guests who are wonderfully knowledgeable in this space to provide a perspective on this really, really important topic. But I guess just to kick us off, Andrew, we know that resources are not limitless, but I'm wondering if you can tell us in a little bit of detail about what your study found.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, David. And thanks for your introduction there, Chris. Gives me a little bit more insight after reading the editorial. But in a kind of potted version, the findings really showed that when we take a cohort of amateur football players from what Football Australia published, so their participation reports, just over 300,000 footballers, that if we were to implement at a national level in Australia, that you could save 1.5 million each year in societal and medical costs. And what that really means is 125 ACL injuries, 4 re-ruptures, 22 cases of knee osteoarthritis, and 3 total knee replacements every year could be averted from a primary prevention perspective. And then we've mapped that sort of like Chris was describing in an economic model. So we've simulated it out over 35 years using a Markov model. That would be over 4,000 ACL injuries could be averted over 35 years if this was to continue to be implemented over that time. And we did a reasonable job at it. And that's important in some ways to remember that we did take into consideration a real world context here, that we understand that this is hard to be implemented widely. And we thought about how many coaches would adopt it, would they continue to maintain doing it, and things like that.
Fantastic. And just to dig back into a little bit of the detail for those of you that are particularly interested in the football, soccer specificity of this program. So your program was a Perform Plus, which I think is derived from the FIFA 11 program. Can you just tell the listeners a little bit just about what that program contains, how long it would take for people to do that on a regular basis, just so they understand the practicality of what that might involve?
Yeah, that's a really good question, David. The Perform Plus is essentially Australia's version of the FIFA 11. So we know the FIFA 11 takes around about 20 to 30 minutes to complete. And that's the same really for the Perform Plus. So all the Perform Plus materials can be found in Football Australia website. But, you know, this type of program can be done at any football club. It doesn't require any equipment. And it's the first part is a little bit of running, a little bit of a dynamic warm-up. And then the second part is more strength and plyometrics. So things like planks, side bridges, Copenhagen exercise, which is a sort of a groin focused exercise, and also Nordic hamstring exercises as well. A lot of the exercises is focused on, you know, landing with a soft knee. So you're really thinking a little bit about the biomechanics as well, but also a focus on performance and not just about injury prevention. Because, you know, in general, coaches, they're more interested in the performance factors rather than the injury risk reduction. You know, to get them on board, if we sometimes change the terminology, that can be useful.
Yeah. And just a little bit more about how this might be implemented and the costs related to that. So how would this be implemented? Is this targeted towards coaches and trainers? And what are the costs associated with implementing a program such as this?
So I think the low-hanging fruit is that only a select amount of coaches would know about this in their coach training. So if we were able to set up when coaches are trained, and the ones that are already got coach badges would need to obviously do a little bit of extra training to find out about this program, so they become aware of it. So some research that I did in my PhD as well, we looked at how many coaches were aware of this program and how many people used the program in Australia. But we looked at the FIFA 11. This was really before the Perform Plus was rolled out, and it's around about, you know, approximately only 18% of coaches were using the the FIFA 11. So we know it's quite low. What was a good finding, or I suppose an interesting finding, was that the coaches that were aware of it, they were using it at high percentages. So the way I see it is that would be the first port of call, really, is that we get coaches aware of it and then we track the progress of their awareness over a period of time to see how that's going.
And Andrew, who would make them aware of that? Is that Soccer Australia? Is that Sport Australia? Do they get trained and accredited in that? And what does it cost the national body, for example, to roll that out?
Yeah, so it would be Football Australia that are doing the coach training. They would obviously have to look at currently what their curriculum is and then how we would actually embed the Perform Plus into that. It is embedded to a degree at the moment, but to embed it into all coaching curriculum, that would be a further exercise. So obviously, if we don't have a program, we don't have costs. So this really was a first step towards understanding that. And the way we got around the barrier of not knowing the costs were to use the costs that New Zealand have gathered from 1999 to 2021, and they've tracked implementation costs. So that's things like logistical costs to train coaches and logistical costs to pay staff to train those coaches. So maybe some physiotherapists, community champions, that sort of thing. So those costs were just under 1 million per year. Although that wasn't what New Zealand, or the costs they gave us, we projected those to Australian costs. So they were just under 1 million per year for doing something like this, which sounds like a lot of money. But when we did the modeling, the money you save is more than the costs of the program. So I think that if New Zealand could do a good job of doing this for, under 1 million, then it's definitely within our sights if we could get some funding for this. And how we do that's another conversation as well, but it would obviously be a sound investment.
Yeah. And so, Andrew, you've touched upon it, but what is the return on investment here? And how does that compare to other sports with similar programs? I think you mentioned these in New Zealand in your article.
Yeah, so the return on investment is $3.51 for every $1 invested. And in general, when they've looked at, because New Zealand's really the only country that's published some other return on investment data, then it's anywhere between $2.50 right up to about $12. So $12 was netball, and then it was a little bit lower for football. But when I spoke to the New Zealand academics, it's something that they're currently looking to publish, I believe, more data on. And really, they highlighted sports such as football, netball, rugby union, and rugby league really as the main areas where they were getting good return on investments for the money that they were putting in for injury prevention.
Yeah. Now, you're obviously focused on football, soccer. Why does this need to be sports specific?
So most of the time, sports will have a sports specific program for it. So if you take New Zealand again as an example, they have netball smart, they've got soccer smart, they've got rugby smart. So they have different types of injury prevention programs. So to implement and to train coaches and all the different types of programs, it just adds that other level of complexity in. So it's more likely that a national or a state-based rollout would occur at football sport and organization level to train the coaches and so forth. So really that was the crux of it. And when you think about it that way, it's one way of doing it.
Yeah. So thanks for relaying the findings of the study. And before I get Chris to weigh in on this, Andrew, do you want to recognize any limitations of what you've done?
Yeah, of course. This is modeling, and the data did come from Australian sources, but there was some data from overseas. So the effectiveness rates were taken from Sweden and Switzerland, and then obviously, as we touched upon before, the cost came from New Zealand. However, about 75% of the other data from Australian sources. So I would say that we've delved quite deeply into some of the systematic reviews and meta-analyses that have been published in this area to try and get the best data possible for this modeling situation.
Yeah, no, wonderful. That's fantastic. Now, Chris, any limitations that you want to highlight here as well?
I'll take a step back, David, to begin with, and first say that look, what we want to see as health economists is that this type of analysis is done that there is some work that goes into thinking about whether or not these interventions are going to be value for money. And what Andrew and his team did was really to bring together a whole range of evidence and put all of that into a health economic model to see if this type of injury prevention program would be a good idea for Australia. Now, I firstly want to go on record to say that's a really good start. And as we said to the MJA, we're really rapt to see our national journal actually publishing these type of things, because they're really helpful for decision makers and thinking about not just does it work, but is it cost effective? And what Andrew's modelling really found was that really in all likelihood, this type of prevention program would be cost effective because as Andrew's mentioned, he was able to run a range of different sensitivity analyses where you can change some of those assumptions and see, well, does it still deliver a good return? And in general, it really did. But as Andrew has noted, there were some limitations, and really the ones that we raised were that a couple of the key inputs were sourced from international studies. So as Andrew's mentioned, the costs were extrapolated from New Zealand, so we don't know exactly what it's going to cost here in Australia. And some of that real-world effectiveness data was extrapolated from Sweden. And so as any kind of amateur sports person would attest, I'm sure that not everyone rocks up half an hour before the game and is ready to do their prevention program. It might be that they're running late, they jump on court, etc. So there's going to be some real-world reductions in how even the best program translates into a population-wide impact. And what we really liked about Andrew's work was that they did include that kind of transition down that, okay, in the real world, if 100% of sports people actually adhere to this is what it might look like. But in the real world, when, okay, not everyone knows about it and not everyone adheres to it, and even if they do adhere to it, they might do it correctly, that there's actually a much lower level of effectiveness. And so by doing that and using the model and running the sensitivity analysis, is actually able to show the impact of some of these limitations. And so what does all of that mean from a health economist perspective? Well, it means that there is good evidence here, but we should still be just a little bit cautious because we don't have the perfect Australian data on particularly the costs and the Australian effectiveness rates. And so really that meant from our perspective, and what we wrote in the MJA article was that, well, perhaps we should just think about how we should roll this out. And can we roll it out in a way that we can gather that information? So just on the off chance that as we roll it out in Australia, perhaps those benefits or costs don't align, that we can do something about it. We can rectify it before we roll it out across the whole country if it's not working as we hope it is.
So do you want to expand a little bit on that, Chris? Because I think particularly in the editorial that you wrote, you spoke about, I guess, a preemptive setup of a data collection strategy before you do a modified rollout. But do you want to just expand a little bit upon that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess, as I've spoken about, if we want to do a pilot or a stepped rollout to see if it's working, we need to be measuring and capturing some data to be able to make that call. And so what we highlighted was that we'd love to see some kind of data capture. We listed a registry in the paper, in the MJA editorial, but we'd be equally happy with some kind of administrative data capture, whether that be run through the AHW, but something that actually lets us capture what the rates of injury look like over time. Because then when Andrew's new interventions rolled out, we can actually look at that and say, well, is it actually having a difference and making the impact that we hope it would? That's clearly not as straightforward. Injuries, and particularly amateur sports injuries, are chronically kind of underreported. But there are a range of things that we could potentially do. And I know the AHW's working group has been kind of systematically going through those to make sure that the reporting could be standardised and to use things around amateur sport to make sure we get that kind of capture rate that we'd be looking for. Things like making sure that we could use assurance data. Most people who go along and play football on a Sunday night or a Saturday would still actually be insured through that competition, and so there should be some capture there. So there's some things like that that from our perspective we need to invest in as a country to make sure that we've got that baseline, so then we can see how things have improved.
Yeah, and I'm really pleased to say that that's hopefully in the process of happening. And the AHW that Chris is referring to is the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare, and they're in the process of working with the sporting codes to see if they can create a national data collection strategy specifically to target that. Why, and Andrew, you may want to comment on this once Chris has, why would we not want to specifically rely upon an ACL registry that's maintained by the surgeons that's presumably reliant on a person seeing the surgeon for what presumptively may be a reconstruction.
Yeah, and from my perspective, if we look at registry versus admin data, they've both got their pros and cons. Typically, registry data can go deeper and get more information around a particular patient, and so they're able to understand a little bit more about a patient's history and their comorbidities and some of those other things that we might not capture at the admin data level. But conversely, admin data typically gets us a much broader spread of the population. So you're getting a better view across Australia. And so really there's pros and cons, and actually typically we see is that they complement each other. And you see that in joint replacement registry work.
Yeah. Andrew, do you want to comment on the proportion of Australians that are having their cruciate ligament reconstructed and the increased number of people that might be trying non-operative strategies?
Yeah, I mean, at the moment, they currently really unknown that what that proportion would be that are going down the non-operative route. I know there's some work being done from University of Melbourne that's currently looking at that a little bit more, and I'm actually going to try and gather some data for the non-operative care side of things. I could comment in football, with you're probably looking at between 2,000 to 3,000 ACL injuries or ACL reconstructions from each year in amateur football that are being reconstructed. So it does seem to be a growing problem, and it's a worldwide phenomenon as well, that it's not just in Australia where numbers are going up, it's going up in all other countries that have published in this area. Sweden, Switzerland have published in this area, and America as well. They're coming up with the same sorts of things. And in New Zealand, a recent paper was published saying about 127% increase in costs over the last just over a decade as well, or a couple of decades actually. So it's all going one way. So I suppose it's not a problem that's going to go away on its own. And one other way to look at this, I mean, the big question here, I suppose, is where does the responsibility lie? So, are we saying that this should be the player's responsibility? Are we saying it should be the coach's responsibility, or the sports organization's responsibility, or the sports insurance responsibility, or the government's responsibility? Yeah, well, it's everybody's responsibility, right? But there is that saying with a higher hierarchy of responsibility should rest on the organization or the person that can have the most effect. So that would possibly be government, right? You would think that with policy, but that's not easy to do. And how do we then get it onto the agenda? That's difficult as well. So, one thing that came out of the paper, and as someone that's played the game and has registered his fees, I register my kids every year, is there a way to get this going by saying, well, for less than a coffee, this is how I would pitch it. For less than a coffee, you could decrease your child or your ACL risk by a large proportion if you were to, at registration time, pay an extra $2.73, which is what we found. If everybody pays $2.73 that registers for football, and that money is distributed to injury prevention, we can have an effect. That's one way of doing it. I know that that's putting the cost to the players and to the parents, but you know what? If someone came to me and said, your daughter would have a decreased risk of this if you paid less than a coffee, I'd say, there's my money. Maybe that's how we have to pitch it.
Fantastic. I don't really like coffee, but I like the argument. Chris, did you want to comment on that?
I also don't like coffee, but I love the argument too. Very succinctly put, Andrew. I just wanted to make one other comment about a limitation of registries, particularly ACL ones led by a surgeon, is that they're capturing the treated, those who actually get that particular treatment. And what they miss is all the other treatments and the non-treatments that might have happened, or the non-surgical treatments that might have happened. And that's a real limitation.
Yeah, yeah. So, Chris, on that note, obviously, Andrew's spoken eloquently about the desire to have this pursued, presumably by those who are highest in the hierarchy. That's the public office. We've seen a number of other pilot programs in other sports, at least in Australia, around Australian rules, netball, and some other sports where they've run pilot programs, but didn't have any longer term sustainable, durable funding for programs to maintain those. Why do we need more pilots?
That's a great question. Ideally, the pilot would be used as some kind of decision point to say, yes, it worked, and if so, we continue to fund. But unfortunately, sometimes in the real world, that's not necessarily the case. But nonetheless, I think from a value for money perspective and from a health economic perspective, given that we don't have that Australian specific data around some of the things that we spoke about, costs and effectiveness, it is important that we actually just take a cautious approach to rolling this out. And one of the ways that we might get around some of those things that you've mentioned is kind of try and pitch it more as a stepped rollout, where you're kind of still pitching full-scale rollout, but you're allowing adjustments on the go. So it's not just that the program and the costs are just rolled out as is to everyone. It's perhaps start in a particular region, learn from that, and then continue that rollout. And I think that's potentially one way to make sure that the pilot doesn't just become dead in the water like some in the past have.
Yeah, wonderful. Now, Andrew, any closing comments on that topic before I get to the closing question?
No, I think what Chris had mentioned about a pilot project, I think it's a pragmatic approach. It's something that I think it's really a good way of doing it. And I know that AIHW, as you mentioned before, David, they're looking at a national database, but we've got to be collecting data from community sport. We've got to be collecting it from allied health, from possibly even GPs as well, and then maybe self-report as well. So, yeah, I think it's a pragmatic approach, that's for sure.
Yeah. And just to really give a plug to the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare and Sport Australia and the major sporting codes for trying to develop a national data injury strategy around this period to really support that foundation that we've been talking about. Andrew, any wonderful pieces of wisdom, advice, or knowledge that you'd like to share for people out there who have osteoarthritis or maybe at risk of getting it?
Yeah, so what I would say would be, because obviously we've been talking about primary prevention, but if you already have osteoarthritis or you've had an ACL recon or a re-rupture, and you're thinking, oh, well, what are my chances of arthritis? It sounds quite high. Well, there is hope, because there are countries at the minute looking at what we'd say secondary prevention, or what could you do to decrease your risk of going from having a joint injury then to knee arthritis. And the research is looking quite promising for doing selective type exercises to try and increase or decrease your risk of then going on to having knee arthritis. So I think seeing a really good physiotherapist that you trust and has looked at your knee and can give you the right type of exercises. We have things like the GLAD program, and that is being rolled out in Australia for people that do already have arthritis. But if you've not got arthritis and you've had an ACL recon, I think it's still worth looking at trying to strengthen that knee up.
Fantastic. Chris, any thoughts, suggestions, words of wisdom from you?
My thought is really just that joint replacement is not a fait accompli, and I'd really implore listeners out there to take that on board. I know there's been a really strong increase in the utilisation of surgeries over the last decade or two, but all of the things that Andrew's talking about, all the things, David, that you do are really highlighting that there are a range of different trajectories, and definitely not all of them end in the need for a joint replacement.
Wonderful. Andrew, Chris, thank you both so much for your really thoughtful and insightful work in this space. It's such an important area, and thank you for spending a little bit of time with us today and sharing those insights with the listeners.
No problem. Thanks, David.
Thanks, David. Thanks, Andrew.
So again, apologies. It was a very technical issue, very complex issue, but one that we really need to dig into to better understand and convey that to our policymakers, and hopefully help you to understand the importance of injury prevention to the community at large. It's not straightforward. It costs money, but there are huge consequences related to injury. So if we could prevent further injuries from happening, it would have huge implications for the community of people who play sport, as well as society as a whole. So should we do more? Undoubtedly. How we do that, we should be thoughtful about it. And hopefully we've given you some understanding of some of the complexity related to this topic today. So again, thank you so much for your continued support of the Joint Action podcast. Really looking forward to have an opportunity to interact with you very soon. But between now and when we next have an opportunity to speak, please do take care of yourself.
Thanks for listening to Joint Action with David Hunter. If you like our show and want to know more, visit www.jointaction.info. If you have any questions, you can email us at hello@jointaction.info and follow us on Twitter @jointactionorg. This podcast was hosted by David Hunter, edited by Vicky Duong, music produced by Jordan Hunter. The information posted on this podcast is not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent disease. Anyone seeking medical advice should consult a health professional.